Good evening, everyone. We're very happy to welcome you all to the 31st lecture of the Distinguished Lecture Series organized by the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia. Today, we have the honor of hosting Professor Ranjan Ghosh. He's professor at Department of English, University of North Bengal, who is here to deliver the talk, The Plastic Turn. We will be recording today's lecture, and at the same time, it's being live streamed for our audiences and subscribers on YouTube. There will be a question and answer session at the end of Professor Ranjan's talk, and all of you are requested to kindly post your questions in the chat box, which will be then addressed to Professor Ghosh. This lecture series is being organized under the guidance of our head of the department, Professor Sivi Malhotra. I request her to kindly deliver the welcome address and introduce Professor Ranjan Ghosh.
Thank you so much, Suman. Professor Ranjan Ghosh, our invited speaker this evening, and someone I call a dear friend, and all others who have joined us. I, on behalf of the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this distinguished lecture series. Friends, this is the 31st lecture of our series, and we're indeed very fortunate to have with us Professor Ranjan Ghosh, one of the leading intellectuals of our times, as our distinguished speaker this evening. It is an honor and privilege for us to host Professor Ghosh, and we're all waiting to hear him speak on the plastic turn, which of course is also the name of his book. I'm extremely grateful to Professor Ranjan Ghosh for agreeing to share his time and scholarship with us this evening. I know he is a reluctant speaker. It's very difficult to secure him to speak, but I'm really grateful to him, and I'm really thankful to you, Professor Ghosh, for agreeing to be a part of our series. I welcome you, and now it is my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Ranjan Ghosh formally, though the fan following that he has on Facebook and elsewhere is something which tells me that probably I don't need to introduce him here for sure. Professor Ghosh, but nevertheless, Professor Ghosh teaches himself in the Department of English, University of North Bengal. Choosing to work from the margins and the provinces, Professor Ghosh, a trans-infusionist, has his publishing interests cover a wide area of subjects like critical theory, comparative literature and philosophy, philosophy or history, philosophy of history and education, cultural theory, and currently, of course, plastic studies. He is widely published in journals like Diacritics, Substance, MLN, University of Toronto Quarterly, Comparative Education Review, History and Theory, College Literature, the Minnesota Review, Oxford Literary Review, Simplok, and others. Among his many books include Thinking Literature Across Continents, which was published in 2016 with J. Hillis Miller from Duke University Press, Philosophy and Poetry, Continental Perspectives, which was published from Columbia University Press in 2019. Plastic Tagore, which was published from Oxford University Press, which is to be published from Oxford University Press, and we're really looking forward to that particular work of his. And the trilogy that he's completing to establish the discipline of plastic humanities, The Plastic Turn, which was published a couple of months back from Cornell University Press. The second and the third of this series are called Plastic Figures, which is again going to be published in 2024, and Plastic Literature. This does not really tell us everything about the thinker, the reader, and the writer that he is, but we are really fortunate, Professor Ghosh, to have you with us. And it's such a pleasure and such a privilege for us to have you. And we're really looking forward to this absolutely, worth waiting for talk of yours, because I know you're going to be speaking about your book and on this very important area of plastic turn. So over to you, Professor Ghosh.
Thank you so much, Simi. It's not only my delight, but also it doesn't really, I was feeling a little alien about the fact that you are talking to me in such professional undertone, because we have never spoken to each other in such formal professional undertone over the years. That's many years that we know each other. So thank you so much to everyone. And I'm also very grateful that you thought me worthy of this invitation and asked me to deliver a presentation here, which I really look forward to. And I really think that this presentation would be a mix of formality and informality, because although I would be talking in a little formal language at times, but the thing is that this particular thing that I want to tell you today about the plastic turn is something that I'm trying to introduce a new plastic theory in the way we start to think about how plastic, the material, starts to influence our ways of thinking in arts, literature, philosophy. So it might be at times a little complicated. Don't be annoyed. And at times it might just be very irritating as well, because you might not be able to get through the sciences into the humanities, because I will be sitting on the fences of the humanities and sciences to explain what I actually mean by plastic term. But hopefully by the end of it, you will raise your hands and give me a shake. So let's wait and see how it really goes in the next 40-45 minutes. I might exceed a little of the time. I mean, please hold on to your patience if that happens, because I really need to make my argument very clear to you. So it's not a formal written text that I'm just going to present, but I'm just going to mix both so that you understand things better. There will be slides, there will be photographs, there will be certain things, diagrams that will be shared. So you might be able to connect, and I'm sure you will be able to connect. So let's see how things really go from here. Just give me a little time. I'm just losing up on, yeah. No, where did I lose it? Just a minute, Simi. I cannot find my paper here. It's that. Can you just go back to the other, the first one when we just began? I'm so technically challenged, you know, that I just don't know where I lost my paper. Just hold on a little, please. Can I move out and can I join again?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I'll just do that because I'm just not being able to connect. And,
Don't add more participants, otherwise Ranjan won't be able to join. So.
can you hear me now, Simi?
Yes.
Yeah, and now I guess you can see me as well. Wait.
Not yet.
Yeah, you will. I think it's taking some time. My connectivity has a bit of problems. It's maybe because of that. I actually lost the page of the paper. So I think it's going to come. Just a moment. Yeah. So yes, my introducing this term, you know, this plastic term into our contemporary discourses, like the way we have spoken about, like the linguistic term, the post-human term, or the material term. There are the terms that have come into our discourses. So when I introduce this term, the plastic term, it really comes with a short history that I would like to share with you all. It all began, when I responded to an issue on turn, just turn, in early 2018 by this very well-known journal called the Diacritics. And the paper that I presented had the same title, The Plastic Turn. Now, this book came much later, but when I was quite sure about what the turn would be, because there was a particular turn that I mentioned, of course, in that paper, that when the book started to unfurl, then it had many more turns in it. And obviously, the curiosity was that what kind of a turn am I talking about? Now, again, in 2018, when I was invited to deliver the mini seminar series at the Critical Theory Institute at University of California, Irvine, which actually brought me in contact with the French philosopher, the very well-known French philosopher, Catherine Malabou, and we are on the same boat ever since. So then I really got myself to believe that, well, I can really now introduce this term, the plastic turn, because after the debate and after all the kind of discussions that followed, not only in the publication or writing of that paper, but also with this mini seminar series that I presented there. But what happened was that this idea of the term, excuse me, this idea of the term, once one says that I turn to plastic or plastic turn, then there are very expected retinue of issues that come up. Very, very expected things like it should connect with the environment, it should connect with pollution, it should connect with globalization. But honestly, this term that this book talks about, Santia, just a kind of one very small dimension of the term that I'm going to present here today. Not all the terms that I can talk about. But what happened is that this book is exclusively not focusing on plastic, like the plastic pollution or what technically is called the discard studies, or what you can call it, the garbology. These are the things that the book is not talking about. Nor is it a kind of a philosophical elaboration of the principles of plasticity, which Catherine Malabou has done so unprecedentedly and so phenomenally. So as part of our petromodernity, the plastic fixes and unfixes this energy regimes that expose us to certain conditions of materiality, socio-cultural conditions of consumption. And as I said, the politics of garbology, commodification, desire, then it comes this unique globalization of need and disposability. But my book and my paper doesn't connect with all this. That is not the term that I'm going to talk about, because what happens is that this term, when it starts to talk about the philosophy of plasticity, then of course Malabou leads the field. When you're talking about the cultural history of material plastic and its impact, then there is a fantastic work by Jeffrey Meeker, who really leads that field again. And then of course there's plastic pollution that harms the physiological system, or maybe transforming our sexualities across species. Then you have a very fine work by Heather Davis. And so then comes this fallouts of climate change and anthropogenic setbacks, the disastrous marine pollution and the plastic economy. These are the discourses that you can immediately think of when you talk about plastic, because you start connecting with these things at all. So when someone told me that you pick up the book Plastic Turn and you say that it's a book that starts to talk about plastic pollution or eco-criticism or ecological disaster or Anthropocene, I'm so sorry to say that's not the plastic term the book is talking about. So the problem is that your first question, listening to what I've said so far, is then what kind of plastic does you are turning to? So what is this plastic turn that you are actually declaring? So that makes me to tell you a few things about, in a novel way, I'm just trying to introduce this plastic theory. What is this plastic theory? Of course, I have had a deep investment in Malabou. I have been reading about the environmental impacts of plastic and the plastic and globalization. But these are the things that do not come into how I figure the turn to plastic, or what I call the plastic turn. So what is the plastic theory? One thing that I would like to begin with, and that is, I'm talking about a principle of material aesthetic, material hyphen aesthetic. That's the term I have introduced in this book. And that's the term that runs through this entire book from over the different kinds of issues that I deal with. What is this material aesthetic? Let me talk a little theoretically at this moment, and I'll try to explain that to you, of course, what it really means. Because if you do not understand, if I cannot make people connect with what I mean by material aesthetic, I will not be able to explain the second half of the talk, or the final half of the talk, where I show you how you can read plastic, or you can just be engaged with plastic and understand literature, not plasticity. I again keep on harping on this, that we were not talking about plasticity interacting with literature or understanding of arts. That is not what the book is doing. The book is, or my project is, or my position is about deep anchorage on the material itself. So it is the material that you have to focus on. I mean, if I'm looking at my phone at this moment, the plastic that is there, and how is this plastic helping me to read literature? So that is where the real interest lies. So let me explain the material aesthetic to you first. Now, I raised this question about how can a thing, just a thing, it becomes an analogical and metaphorical axis for critical reflection. Like, how can an object or a thing, just a thing, a material thing, can build a kind of a relationality that an object may stimulate? And that's when that relationality is stimulated by the object, you're moving into a theoretical formulation. So it is like a kind of a theory game, a kind of a theory pattern that you're trying to build from the thing itself. So when Peter Gallison, for that matter, this historian of science, he is talking about the concept of the theory machine, where in a mundane object, a very mundane object, under appropriate circumstances, can help generate complex theoretical structures. So something that doesn't look theoretical, like plastic, which is just about ubiquitous, just about anywhere that you can see. How is that plastic starts to build a kind of a theory machine? That is exactly what I'm trying to do here, and that's what I'm trying to explain. So a person like Sadi Carnot would say that water was a theory machine, or Zygmunt Bauman actually talking about seeing how molecular and scalar properties of water in modernity, or say Peter Sloterdijk talking about the globalization as form. Now, theory, I mean, theories, they constantly cut across and complicate our descriptive parts. But theory, for that matter, say seawater, or foam, or here, what we are talking about, the plastic. So they actually become a machine. They become a structure. They help you to understand certain things which are completely unprecedented, completely unexpected. So how is that possible? That is where I'm taking you to. How can I do this? Or how have I framed or theorized it? That's the point. So there is an analogical predication now around the thing or an event. And this analogical predication means that if a plastic is a word, then plasticity becomes enclosure schemes. I'm sorry again that these are the when you connect the book, there are a few technical terms, quite a few technical terms. I'm just being modest at quite a few technical terms that come into, and then of course you get some pause and poise to go through the lines. But when I'm delivering the talk, I know someone can be very impatient after 5 or 10 minutes, saying that, oh my God, there's too many things being bombarded on me, and I'm just not in the right shape of things to really carry on with the talk. So I'm not going to introduce these terms, but there are certain things that I cannot avoid because I'm trying to establish a completely different vocabulary here in this book, where if you are talking about certain ways of reading literature, we all have been theoretical, critical, interpretive, but we have never told ourselves that how being on the border of the sciences, where humanities and sciences, they're interacting with each other, and there is a sort of a communication negotiation between them. How is that changing our discourses of understanding literature or writing about a poem, or maybe writing about a novel or talking about theory. So it is not exactly those words from the French theory that starts to pop into your discourse, where you say dispositive, or you start to say trace, or you start to feminine. You just have so many French terms that come and crowd your discourses. That is not exactly what was intended. I just wanted to do something which changed the discourse of academic writing, which you will see later when I read out from the book and try to explain those ideas to you. So the thing is that when one does this critical, creative thinking, then there is a poesis of plastic analogy. This is an analogical problem that I'm talking about. And what would that be? Because plastic, if it's a material, then it has two states of being, primarily two states of being, or broadly two states of being. One would be when plastic is inside the laboratory. That's a different plastic. That's a completely different plastic about which I'll talk. And there is another plastic that exists outside the laboratory, like a comb, or like my cell phone, or any other pen, or whatever. So that is outside, a toy that is outside the laboratory. So is it that we can look at plastic in two ways? One is inside the laboratory plastic, in laboratory plastic, and the other is the out laboratory plastic, or outside the laboratory plastic. So once we get to that part, we try to understand that this is exactly how the plastic term can be interpreted. Remember, one thing is very important here. I just want to tell you very quickly before I come to the little bit of a theory here in the next 5 minutes. When someone writes about the plastic in the laboratory, then the person is doing polymer sciences. And that kind of books are very different books where you would not be interested to read them. I have spent my last 4 years reading polymer sciences because I realized that I'm trying to do something very different, so that I invested myself in the polymer sciences. But polymer sciences doesn't talk about environmental pollution. Polymer sciences is not talking about the Anthropocene. Polymer sciences is not talking about how plastic or roll about. No, he's not talking about that. What polymer sciences does is that it mostly focuses on the plastic behavior, or the plastic nature, or you can say the plastic, we can say the chemopoiesis of the plastic within the laboratory. That's what you talk about. So there's a different branch. The second group, who doesn't see eye to eye, is the environmentalist, or ecologist, or eco-critics, who will talk about plastic and pollution, who will talk about this ingestion of plastic, who will talk about the invasive ecology of plastic. So that is, they are not interested in what's going on inside the laboratory and what kind of a graph that plastic is taking, what is called a glass temperature, what is called a coefficient, how does the plasticizers come to build a polyvinyl chloride like PVC. They're not interested in that. So this is an interesting place where I start to become this person who is a negotiator. And what kind of a negotiator I am is that I start to read polymer sciences, and then I also read environmental sciences, or the kind of impact that plastic could have on climate change and other issues, or art. And then I try to see whether there is kind of a negotiation that can be built. So my job is here, like I'm trying to engineer a brokerage between the two and see whether that works. Now, the problem is that if you're trying to bring two things together, then how do you do it? The first thing that comes to your head is, if you are really doing polymer sciences, and if you are doing environmental sciences, then you are doing, say, the marine pollution, the sea pollution. So you're reading facts, you're reading scientific data, you were reading scientific papers, which I had to read a lot. I have to see that how the fish, planktons, and other things are getting infected by that, or affected by it. And then I'm seeing how a polyvinyl chloride is formed in the laboratory. What is the temperature? What is a glass transition temperature? What is rheology? Now, these are terms from the polymer sciences. How does that happen to produce plastic? So now there are two things here. When you connect them, when you bring them together or negotiate, does it help you to read literature? Now, that's a very riddlesome question. That's a question that might just make you throw your back and say, how is that possible? That is simply impossible. How can you do that? I mean, how can you get into a laboratory, look at the way plastic is formed, and Looking at that, how can you talk about literature? That's not possible. So let's see whether we can really do that or not, and produce a different plastic term for all of you here to experience a different term. So let us come to this analogical coevalence. That is, you have a material that is plastic. And what are you doing with this material? The material has 2 points of existence. As I said, in laboratory, and there is outside the laboratory. So it's the material. So if it's the material, this material is connecting with the aesthetic. What is the aesthetic? The aesthetic is the doing of a literature, writing of a poem, understanding of a poem, art, philosophy. All these are the aesthetic part of it. So is there a connection between the two? If you want to put this material in communication or correspondence with the aesthetic, then how do you do that? You try to bring in this theory of material aesthetic, which I introduced in this book. And in trying to do this theory of material aesthetic, I put a hyphen in between. I'm not saying material aesthetic, I'm saying material hyphen aesthetic. So let me explain why am I using this hyphen through a work, through the analogy, through the philosophy and the theory of analogy. I will not get into the details, as I told you. If you are interested, please connect with my book and see how those theoretically I have produced in the first chapter. In a book, you have more patience here. You don't have that. I can completely understand. So analogy, it is just a few words here. Analogy actually works in 2 ways. One is denominative analogy, and the other is the analogy of proportionality. So if you say analogy, denominative analogy, that's a relational analogy. That is, X is related to Y. But if you say analogy of proportionality, then that is based upon relation of relations. Now, what that means is that you have X, say material, and Y, say the aesthetic. Can you share the first 3 slides with? Yes, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I will. I'm sorry. I lost it again. I'm being so stupid. I just lost it, Simi. Where did I leave this? How can I get back to this? My paper, Can anyone help me out with this? It's a Zoom on my screen. So how do I go back to the paper?
Maybe if you press escape.
Okay. Okay. I'm so sorry. This is very annoying. I'm so sorry. I just wanted to see the slides and I just missed it out. Would you have the patience to get me in again?
Sure.
I'm just losing it because I'm not very used to this thing. Yeah. So I will continue with this. I'm sorry. Very, very sorry, because this is getting a little difficult because I don't actually do Zoom talks that much. So I'm being a bit of a nuisance, I know.
Perfectly
But,
fine.
but yes, I continue with what I was saying. Now, this is where the 2 kinds of analogy comes in. That is the denominative and the analogy of proportionality. But when you're talking about intraschematism, then it means that X, it starts to contrast each other, X and Y. So the slides that you can see, the slides will tell you actually that what it's trying to do. If you can read through those slides, you will see I have just about prepared that so that you can follow my explanation better. So X and Y, they start to contrast each other. Say X, which is the, I said, the material, and Y, that is the aesthetic. Try to see this way. It will be easier for you all to understand. X is plastic, and say Y is the poem. Say, how is it that the plastic helps you to understand it? Mostly what we have done over the years is that we have actually talked about, say, plastic in literature. So there would be a great many writings, like Gravity's Rainbow, for that matter. P. Shaw's Gravity's Rainbow talks about plastic there in the novel. But this is not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is that X would be the material, the plastic, and say Y is the poem. So if the Y is the poem, how do you bring that together? Just the material and the poem. And the important part is that this material is helping you to read the aesthetic. And this aesthetic is something that is drawing itself out of the material. So how is that possible? So in that case, there were three things rather, that is going to come up. One is that if you have XY, as you can see in the slide, if you have the form of an XY, then you see that the material is overlapping the aesthetic. That is one substituting the other. So that is the XY. But if you say X hyphen Y, you see that the material is relationalizing the aesthetic without either of them losing their distinctive identities. So there is a relationship that builds between X and Y, but Y stays on with its identity as much as plastic stays on with its identity. We are not talking about plasticity at all. Please don't get to this conception that I'm talking about the plasticity of a poem. No, it is the plastic that is helping me to understand the aesthetic. So what happens here is that there are many things that this book does, which actually would be easy for you to understand. And that is, say I'm talking about, when you're talking about this intra-scheme, this is one of the technical words which I'm trying to avoid, but I cannot at this point. Intra-scheme. Intra-scheme actually would mean that plastic is a material X and plastic is an aesthetic in itself. So the plastic itself becomes an aesthetic. That is, plastic is actually the way plastic behaves, the way plastic is, both inside the laboratory and outside the laboratory, the way it is, it starts to tell you that there is an aesthetic hidden inside the material, which starts to explain literature for you. So how is that possible? Let me tell you that I will not be able to show you that in the course of this talk today, but there is one aspect that I will show. But in this book, you would see that this plastic sea, which I call the plastic sea, where there is tons and tons of plastic inside the sea. I mean, there would be more plastic pellets than fish in the ocean. So how is that a plastic sea can help you to read world literature? So plastic sea is the material, world literature is the aesthetic. Plastic sea as the material is an aesthetic by itself, which explains how you do world literature. Or say, for that matter, inside the laboratory, that is outside the laboratory, plastic sea. But you go to the inside the laboratory where you see plastic polymerization, how plastic is behavior, plastic is formed, how plastic behaves, what is the chemical equation, how the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen come together with producing this covalent bonding, co-bonding, all kinds of double bonding. All these are technical terms. How is that happens in connection with how you consider modernist intertextuality, and you start to talk about, say, Westland, or you start to talk about maybe Kurt Sweeters or Julia Kristeva, for that matter, when you just talk about intertextuality. So the thing is that we are coming into a kind of an asymmetrical understanding. So if it is an asymmetrical understanding, then because it's asymmetric completely, I tell you why. Because plastic sea and world literature are not connected. If I throw these two words at you and say, have you seen this pollution and the plastic in the ocean, especially say in Atlantic or the Pacific, the huge garbage patch in the Pacific? You said yes, but that is material. Does it remind you of world literature? You will be completely confused, because you will not be able to see the symmetry there, the correspondence there. So what I'm trying to tell you is that this is the asymmetricity of the aesthetic and the material coming together, the matter and the mattering. So if you talk about plastic behavior inside the laboratory, how does that explain literary interpretation? How does that make one understand a poem? So this is basically about two things, as you can see in the slide there, that there is the denominative. One is the denominative. I'm saying X as Y. Don't have to bother too much about this, but I have to come to points. So I have to mention them. The denominative, that is the X as Y. Then there is a deductive, where Y is drawn from X. Then there is a representation of, well, X is like Y. And then comes the asymmetrical. This is the point. When you talk about the asymmetrical, then it's the X hyphen Y and the XY. But my turn here, this is the final part. This is the my turn here that I'm trying to establish. It hinges on the X hyphen Y, where the hyphenation in particular brings about this analogical or metaphorical motor. So the point is that when you are talking about this hyphen, then X and Y, this is the material aesthetic that this book is talking about. And what happens is that this material, this plastic is in this book, is the material form, it is the material discourse, it is a representation, it is a negation of understanding in both its materiality and aesthetics of materialization. So it has its own materiality. At the same time, this materiality also establishes or manifests itself as a kind of an aesthetics of the materialization. So in its material presence, we are all the time talking about plastic. That's the most important part. Plastic here becomes both referential, designatory, and significatory at the same time. So what is important is that plastic becomes visible. Plastic is haptic, which you can touch. It is diagrammatic or geometric. It is also referential. It is structural. It is curvilinear. It is differential. And at the same time, it is figural. So this part I would like to stop here because it would get a little more difficult because the theoretical part is more or less something that I have been able to communicate to you. That is the material aesthetic. That is what I am going to talk about. So there are other terms in this book, well, this material and the aesthetic, but let me come directly to one term that I'm going to talk to you about would probably help me to explain this operative theory machine of this material aesthetic to you. I explain this, and of course, when I take questions from you, it will be much more easy for me to explain things at that point. So, but before I begin to demonstrate how this my plastic theory works, let me tell you that I've tried to write in and introduce a language that borders on the sciences and the humanities. So it's a very different vocabulary, which I believe can really contribute a lot in changing the way we think and express at this moment. Our critical vocabulary would be very different if one starts to connect with the kind of discourse that I've produced here. So now when I talk at this moment, I'll be reading certain portions from the book. So when I talk now, I urge you to take a notice of the different language in which this literary critical interpretation goes on. So let me tell you something about plastic. Now I say that polymeric structuration informs the core of 20th century critical consciousness. Now it is plastic in structure and property. The entire 20th century critical consciousness is plastic in structure and property. Now I'm making some big claims here. With the modernist appropriation of, say, cross-linkages, now these are terms that I'm pointing from polymer sciences, cross-linkages, crossovers, intertextual paradigms like adaptation, appropriation, pastiche, simulation, parody, recto, we are thrown into the midst of a plastic intertextuality. If Kristeva is talking about intertextuality, I would like to revise that to say that it is a plastic intertextuality now, something that we might call as plastic avant-gardism as well. So 20th century thinking in arts and literature, especially arts and letters, is deeply relational as it flows and oozes into the discourses of the plastic. So let me change the discourse here to say that you have talked about different kinds of textuality, like you've talked about postmodern textuality, you've spoken about formalist textuality, new critical textuality. But let me use this term here. You call it the first textuality, then you call it the heterochain textuality. So when you say the heterochain textuality, I probably ask you to go for the slide 5 a little, if you can change that. Yes. So if you see this, then you would see this is the heterochain textuality, because that is how the different long chain molecules, they make up a large series of interconnected links. Now, it is the size of the molecules and their structures and physical states that determine the properties of the plastic, properties that determine their ability to get molded and shaped. Now, these are also heterochain polymers. Let me talk a little about plastics. After all, you are enduring plastics here, so we need to endure plastics, some discussion on plastic as well. So let me carry on with this, but just follow the kind of a language that I'm actually quoting from the book at this moment. So there are also the heterochain polymers in which compounds have oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur atoms as their backbone chain. Now, thermoplastics such as polyethylene and polystyrene are molded and remolded repeatedly. Now, it is the external heat that makes them change their shape and form. And in thermoplastics, individual molecules are separate from one another and flow past one another. They have properties of separability and consequent mobility. So plastic responds to low temperature in developing complexity. Not much hard effort is required, which means plastic can change its bonding and crossover multiplication under low external changes. And this demonstrates how plastic builds its own plasticity and is self-disintegrating. Now, in both versions, I mean, if you're looking at thermoplastics for that matter, there are linear chain polymers that soften on heating and solidify on cooling. I'm just trying to take you, get you a little acquainted and familiar with how plastic behaves, because that's very important for me. Cross-linked plastics are network structures, as you can see in that diagram there. The cross-linked plastics, they're a network structure. So this is the intertextuality undertone that I'm trying to go to. So the repetition of units in the polymers can result in a regulatory structure, which may have important consequences. Now, some properties depend on the organic structure that involves carbon bonding. Some result from long chain or network structure, and the former include density, dielectric permittivity, melting and softening temperatures, and the interaction with solvents, acid, and bases. So there is a restless with activity and possibility. So when plastic is being prepared, this is an in-laboratory talk that I'm giving you at this moment. I'm showing you the in-laboratory plastic. So there is a kind of a restlessness with activity and possibilities. And this heterochain polymerization, in behavioral and structural properties, it materially, aesthetically informs the dominant textual consciousness of the 20th century. If there is a dominant textual consciousness of the 20th century, that is what you can see inside the laboratory, what plastics is doing. That's the claim. That's where you are turning to in the plastic term. Now, there are many things that I would like to say. I don't know whether I really have enough time. So I'm skipping certain things. When you ask me questions, then I can come to this, the Brazilian avant-gardism that I spoke about in this book, and where I have spoken about some Brazilian artists, conceptual artists, and how actually they started bringing in the different kinds of conceptual art, which I think is extremely plastic in nature. They are drawing the entire program that you see in the laboratory certainly corresponds with the kind of program that this artist brings into their writing. But yes, this probably there is not much time for that. But I will talk about this if you have questions later. But let me make this very shocking claim here, and then in the next 15 to 20 minutes, whether I'll wind up my talk. The shocking claim is that I'm claiming a kind of textuality, which I say crystalline amorphous textuality. And then I asked this question, the T.S. Eliot's famous poem, The Wasteland. Now, this Wasteland probably the best and the most well-known poem, the most discussed poem in the 20th century. So T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, I claim, is polyethylenic. It is a polyethylenic poem. And I also claim that the Wasteland is also like a PVC, a polyvinyl chloride. But how? Let me come to this and talk to you about it, and I will love to explain that to you as well. You know, the interproperties of plastic, it expresses through chemical composition, temperature, pressure variability. There is a fluctuation gradient. And plastic provides a scheme and a wave of communication. It provides multiple polymeric crossovers and organic doubling, the complex equations of blending and mixing with the different, the transformed, and the conflictual. Please note, this is a language from the book. So I'm trying to change again, as I say, that vocabulary here, the critical vocabulary. Now, Wasteland in all has 5 sections, which becomes a kind of a crossover figure, crossover again from polymer sciences, crossover figure quoting across literature and discourses in a kind of a circularity of reading. Now, patterns also exist as the amorphousness of links and linkages, and there is this copolymericity that manifests in how Dante, Shakespeare, Baudelaire, Bible, Webster, body camp songs, tarot cards, contemporary newspaper accounts all come together. So there is the bonding, as you can see, the covalent and copolymeric bonding that the image that I showed to you. Maybe that you can show the slide, the next slide, if you want. Can you show the next slide, please? I will just, yes. So you can see this. This is called the spaghetti model in polymer sciences. And the Wasteland, when you were reading this poem, you would see that it really, in a way, it appropriates or it comes very close to this spaghetti model, where you have the Dante, Shakespeare, Baudelaire, Bible, Webster, Buddhist fire sermons, or Brihadaranya Upanishad, or tarot cards, newspaper accounts all coming together. This is the spaghetti that the entire polymer sciences tell you. So if Eliot is doing this, Eliot is actually diagrammatically, if you want to represent the poem, the aesthetic of the poem can really be produced out of the materiality of the plastic, the way it actually, the amorphousness or the amorphous crystalline textuality, the way it works. So this is an important argument. I think you're gradually going to get what I'm trying to say here. So on this note, the important thing that happens here is that we come down to a very high density polyethylene, which is composed of macromolecules where the long carbon chains are our points of tension. Can you go to the slide 8, please? The next one. Yes. As you can see this diagram here, this is the formation of the high density polyethylene. And once you see that, you would see that this is a polyethylene where there is a chain transfer. There is, unless this polyethylene is, when this polyethylene is formed, you know, there is a behavioral manifestation of a high density polyethylene and a low density polyethylene. And this is due to a macromolecular structure. So high density polyethylene is a rigid translucent solid. But this LDPE, which is the low density polyethylene, it is a soft translucent solid that deforms badly. Very quickly it deforms. Now, what happens here is that there is a tangled existence with a degree of crystallinity, which is influenced by 3 factors. One is that the chain length, one is the chain branching, another is the interchain bonding. Now, all these words, I'm repeating it again, chain length, all from polymer sciences. That's why I said that the vocabulary is very different. Chain length, chain branching, and interchain bonding, all these are significantly constituting the plastic intertextuality. So you can call this not just modern text or intertextual text. Do call them text polymers. They are plastomers. They are text polymers. And Wasteland is actually morphalizing on this macromolecularity of concepts, ideas, context through a chain length, where fire sermon comes with Buddha, Buddha comes with a child rhyme, child rhyme comes with the Holy Grail legend, or it comes with the Greek myth. So there is a kind of a chain length and a chain extension, branching, bonding, whatever happens with the plastic, as you can see there in the laboratory, these are exactly what they are happening in the poem, in the domains of crystallinity. These are called the branch chains. And if you say amorphousness, these are long unbranched connections. So what happens is that the plastic text, such as the Westland, I'm going to call most modernist text plastic text, whether it's Ulysses or whether it's Waiting for Godot, that's a plastic text like the Westland. They're a mix of high crystallinity and amorphous regions. They are demonstrating different levels of permeability and polymer repeat units. So textual polymerization actually is stiff, definitive, and flexible, that is accommodative. So whether you talk about this poem or you talk about the counterparts in Joyce's Portrait of an Artist or Finnegan's Wake, they are all conducting chain transfers that divert the chain growth as we encounter inter and intramolecular thought into formations of variety of ways and routes, variety of ways of reading. And through polymer science, you can call it MERS, 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 MERS. If you have roots, roots, and roots to really understand a modernist text or a postmodernist text, in a different vocabulary, you can call it the MERS, MERS, and MERS, because MER means the multiple. So what happens here is that if you're looking at this diagram there as the equation, which I've understood or explained to you in details in the book, I'll just explain that to you very quickly here so that I can come to the last section. That is, there are 5 fragments in this poem, say the Burial of the Dead, the Game of Chess, the Fire Sermon, the Death by Water, and What the Thunder Said. So these are 5 fragments. Now, what you would see that there is a high intensity macromolecularity where there is a chain transfer. Like if you were reading, say, the Burial of the Dead, if the first part you're reading, that is enough a poem to understand what Eliot's themes are. But if you're going to the Game of Chess, then there is a chain transfer. The chain actually becomes an amorphous, long branched chain that connects the Burial of the Dead with the Game of the Chess. When you read the book, you'll see how I have demonstrated that. So what happens is this process, it becomes a semi-crystalline poem where there are chain entanglements, there are differentials, and Westland, in a way, through an equation, a chemical equation, it becomes polyethylenic. So if you say that Westland is a modernist poem, let me annoy you and let me shock you by saying that Westland is polyethylenic poem. So what happens is that you have 5 polymeric units now. So far in a classroom lecture on Westland, you must have said that there are 5 fragments of the poem. Now, in a different classroom atmosphere, you start to say that there are 5 polymeric units in the Westland. And these are all radical polymerization, which actually begins with an unchecked chain transfer reactions. So when you say this particular way of explaining, you say that, say the water, just one last explanation. The concept of water in Westland, it shifts from one fragment to the other, where Eliot says rock without water and water without rock. Then you come to death by water. Then you go to what the thunder said, and then you have again the concept of the water. So this is the water that actually, if you look at the polymeric equation there, the polyethylenic equation there, you will see that there is a kind of a chain transfer, a molecular transfer, which produces the polyethylene at the end. But this water in this poem can be considered to be a thought molecule transfer. That's what the argument of the book says. It's a thought molecule transfer where every section of this poem is long chain and is deeply polymerized in meaning units, concept bonds, and they connect together to form a supramolecular chain status that is often coiled or twisted, as you saw in the earlier slide, as you had seen. They're all coiled and twisted. So the Westland becomes a kind of a supramolecular chain. So all these the things that I'm telling you, where one individual polymer molecules, they move relatively to each other, and it may change its orientation. So Death by Water, it slides, the one section of the poem, it slides and slips and flows into What the Thunder Said. It just slips and flows. That's how the polymer flow occurs when you're looking at plastic in the laboratory. That is how it forms. Any kind of plastic formation that you see, a PVC or any other polyethylene, there is a slip and flow that happens in the movement of the plastic. That is exactly what is happening in this poem, because you're using that concept to understand. So interestingly now, the plastic intertextuality becomes the real reality, because plastic intertextuality starts to tell you that you can now talk about intertextualization in a very different way, because plastic textual plasticities, they can leave certain formations not fully explained. Certain formations can be explained in plastic, certain formations cannot be explained in plastic. I say certain formations can be explained in a text. You cannot explain certain formations in a text. Neither can the writer explain, nor can the reader explain. It is what actually happens. So first we talk about heterochain textuality. Now we spoke about crystalline amorphous textuality. And this is the last section that I say plasticizer textuality. Because, you know, when you are plasticizers are something that you introduce into plastic. And once the plastic has to be molded and shaped into different forms, these plasticizers move in to the formation or the polymeric chain, or as I call it, supramolecularity. And it starts to change the volume of that plastic so that it really shapes to become, whether it's a mobile phone or whether it's become a fountain pen, or sorry, or maybe a comb or any other thing that we have so much plastic around us, almost overwhelmed by. So I say that the 20th century critical consciousness is a sink and space of plasticizers. This entire critical consciousness has the sink and space of plasticizers, influencing the interpretive life of text and contributing to its expansion, swell, and resistance. So what happens under plasticization is that all major texts that have caught our imagination and built a permanent shelter, that some texts are viscoelastic, they bend and recover, some are unhinged and reshaped, and they undergo longer and relentless deformations. So importantly, all major texts across world literature through the century are plasticizer textual in nature. They have tensility, they have compressibility, they have shear forces to go with. Again, I'm using this word completely for polymer sciences, so you might just not be familiar with that. But when you're reading my book, you would see there are lots of footnotes there explaining that how these terms, they connect with your literary interpretation. But I'm reading this just to give you a different experience of how a literary text can be written, or the literary discourse of a literary text can be written. So interesting now is that I'm not getting into the other details of it, but I will tell you that if I say now that Eliot's Westland is a PVC, then how do I prove that? How do I really show that the material aesthetic coming together? How is it that the material aesthetic of the Westland, if it is considered a PVC, how does it work? And what is a PVC then? Let me, for people who are not aware of it, PVC is a polyvinyl chloride, otherwise known as PVC or vinyl. And it is one of the most analyzed, tested, and versatile thermoplastics. So PVC can be rigid or flexible, clear or opaque. It can be processed as a solution, paste or powder, extruded, injection. It can be reverse rolled, coated. So you can do many things with the PVC. Now, what happens in PVC is that if you consider the Westland to be a PVC, then what you get out of this? To do this, I will not get into the discourses again. I will just introduce two things to you. The first two theories from polymer sciences to explain. Because if you think that there is a long line of discourse that starts to explain how Westland and PVC works, that is Westland as Y and the PVC as the X, because PVC is the material and Westland is the aesthetic, and how do they come together? Let me show you the second slide. The next slide, please. Can you show me this lubricity model? The lubricity model here. I'm sorry, I had to send you a PDF, so maybe that it's getting a little difficult. Uh, yes, yes, yes. This is the model. This is the model that I'm talking about. This is called the lubricity model. As you will see at the top, as you can see there in the top, that there are two units. There are two units at the top, which are the carbon and the oxygen. They are forming that sort of a the plastic. But it is, when this plastic polymer works at the beginning, it is actually the picture that you see at the top. That is not without plasticizers. So you can see a marked difference between when you are putting the plasticizers into the plastic there in the down, below the page. Then you would see that there is an increase in length between the two structures to flow of plastic, as you can see it. This is technically called the free volume. As I've written out there, the free volume that you can see has increased between them. So you are introducing plasticizers. If you mark that image very closely, you will see I've introduced plasticizers so that the polymeric structure of the plastic, it increases, it dilates, and you are producing a free volume or fusion there. And what is this free volume? This free volume increases, and once the free volume increases, the plastic can mold into different shapes. So one can go to have maybe a plastic tap, or one can also build a cone. So that's sort of a change that happens to the plasticizers. Now, if this is exactly what is happening, this is the material inside the laboratory. Now turn that into the aesthetic. If you're putting it into the aesthetic, you will see the Westland is exactly doing that. Take out all the plasticizers out of it. Say I take out Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, I take out the Child Rhyme, I take out Dante, I take out Thomas Cade, I take out Tiresias, out of that Westland, and I start to read the poem. Then, of course, you get this polymer structure working. But once you're putting the plasticizers, I call it the external plasticizer and internal plasticizers. This is a little complicated, so don't get into that. I would just say the external internal plasticizers that you put inside the poem, immediately the free volume of the poem increases. So if the free volume of the poem increases, what happens is either you interpret the poem as an eco-critical poem, or it becomes a philosophical poem, as it becomes a comb, as it becomes a plastic tap, or it becomes a mobile phone. So exactly the poem also starts to take different meanings out of that, because you've increased the free volume by introducing external and internal plasticizers into it. So this is exactly the image. This is the theory of the lubricity, the lubrication of plastic. This lubricity theory exactly falls in place with Westland. So what was material as a lubricity model, as the material, starts to work as the aesthetic in the poem. So what happens now is that, very importantly, the Westland is exposed and is invested in different plasticizers, and its varying plasticization effects causes the dislodging of meaning sites. And so what happens? Through side chains and end group, this trans-epistemic discourses comes up, and the poem starts to free up its meaning volume. The meaning volume of the poem starts to free up. So you might just ask yourself, how is Westland surviving after 100 years? It's only the reason that my plastic theory would give you, or turn to plastic would give you, is that it has started to free up its meaning volume, because it has so much of internal, external plasticizers to work with. So maybe this is one such way of looking at this poem through this model. Now, one last point, that if you can show up the next slide, where there is another theory that is called the gel theory. This is the lubricity model, lubricity theory, and now comes the gel theory. Yeah, the next slide.
So this is the next slide.
Okay, this is the next one. Okay, so when you are looking at this gel theory, then you see that the Westland as a polymer text, what it is doing here, it is that it is expected to create a stable mixture with the original PVC, which means plasticizers must end stability and form correspondence with the original polymer. This is how the polymer science works. That is, if there isn't a stable mixture with the original PVC, then obviously the whole thing will be very amorphous and you won't get the shape. To get the shape, you need to have a kind of what you call it, the polar correspondence. That is, one pole, say the negative and the positive, they should really come together to form a polar correspondence. Only then you get a particular shape. So what happens is, that if you are looking at a plasticizer to be an effective and useful in PVC, it must contain two types of structural components. One is that a polar and an apolar, as you would see in the diagram. So that there has to be a balance between the polar and the non-polar portions of the molecule. That is essential. I mean, I cannot just put in as many plasticizers I can into a poem and let the poem have a free volume. No, a free volume will not be built if you are not putting a kind of polar and the non-polar portions into a molecule with a balance. So Westland is not an imbalanced poem that way. Westland is a PVC because the polar and the non-polar portions of the Westland molecule, if you call the poem a Westland molecule, that is so well negotiated, that is so well balanced, that the child rhyme and Spanish tragedy, and the Spanish tragedy and Buddhist sermon, and Buddhist sermon and Holy Grail, they are really having a sort of negotiation between them. There is a balance there. And this is exactly what Westland does by bringing the polar and the non-polar balance through its own plasticizers, and all the other plasticizers that come into this poem, they are altering its crystallinity. Unless there is a balance, you cannot have a shade. Unless the polar and the non-polar negotiate between themselves, you cannot produce a different PVC. You cannot produce a different meaning game for the poem. So in gel theory, this is the last part of the, I will just take 5 minutes more. This is the gel theory. When you get into that, you would see that we are encountering internal plasticizers. The problem is that when you're looking at lubricity model, then I'm talking about the external plasticizers. When I'm talking about the gel theory in the Westland, then this gel theory of plastic would be the internal plasticizers, where the polymeric chain, it dilutes to produce a lot of mobile space. Let us come back to the last 10 lines of the poem. I cannot put those lines here for you, but if you go back to read the book, you would see that I have given a very detailed explanation of the last 10 lines of the poem. And the last 10 lines of the poem are very interesting, because if you go to the last 10 lines, these are the internal plasticizers. External plasticizers were those Brihadaranya Upanishad, the Holy Grail, the Buddhist sermon, or a reference to Middleton, or the post-Shakespearean tragedy. All these were the external plasticizers. But if you're coming to the last 10 lines of this poem, you would see that there is a burst of plasticizers, but they're all internal plasticizers, which is why I introduced the gel theory here to explain. And what happens there? You get the figure of the Fisher King, you get the echo of the words of Isaiah, you get the prayer of the Italian poet Todi, you get a refrain from a nursery rhyme, you get Dante's Purgatorio, you get an anonymous Latin poem, you get Tennyson's The Princess, a line from the sonnet by Joran Naval, you can also get Thomas Gates' Spanish tragedy, you get the Upanishads word Shanti. All these come together in the internal plasticizers in the last 10 lines. So what they do is that they gel with the main polymeric chain, and it increases the free volume of the poem. So within the gel theory, we see that there is a plasticized polymer is neither solid nor liquid, but it's an intermediate state. This entire poem has an intermediate state where there is a 3-dimensional network of weak secondary bonding going on. And this interclutch of plasticizers in the end, what they do, they flex and dilate this poem polymeric chain. And the plasticizers referring to Sanskrit, Italian, Latin, and the Spanish literary context, they open up the free volume in a border-bashed planetarity in a kind of a cosmopolitan cohabitation. So the Westland grows up to become a PVC. So what this does here, finally, is that the whole idea of, this cross-linked understanding, polymeric understanding of literature, the aesthetic from the material starts to walk through. And what we can conclude, finally, is that although there are other terms that I have spoken about in this poem, but this entire idea of trying to understand literature, understanding arts, rests on the material. That is the material. And through the material aesthetic, what we do is that no understanding of plasticity would actually be a pre-materialist phenomenon. Now, I say this not as a kind of authoritative hegemonic statement, but this is a position that I am putting out because plasticity existed before plastic was discovered. Also, plasticity came differently after plastic was discovered in the 1910 and 1920s. So plastic is a very, very recent new material that has come there in 100 years. But before that, there was plasticity, whether you go to William James or whether you go to Goethe, or whether you go even back to the Hegel and Heidegger, whom Malabov has worked so well into. So plasticity is this not for me here, the pre-materialist phenomenon, but a material figural event that comes after the discovery of plastic. So our consciousness all through has never been without the plastic material. So what I can say finally in the end is that once plastic, it is always plastic. And once text, that is always intertext. So art has always been plastic. You know, thinking always, I mean, I would say art has not always been plastic. That's a very important part. Art has not always been plastic. Thinking always was. We try to stop thinking over plastic, but plastic calls out on us to think. We veered to plastic and all turnings became plastic, and in it all returns too. So plastic turn, if you call it, it is through this material aesthetic plasticos, or this whole idea of the theory machine of the material aesthetic has unmade us and has ungrounded the way we can think, express, and live. I think we have always been plastic. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ranjan, for that absolutely fascinating formulation. And I'm sure, I mean, this talk is going to egg on people to have a look at your book and to read that book. But I'm not going to stand between you and the questions that I know are overflowing already. And so I'm going to pass on this virtual mic to my colleague and friend here, Grace. And Grace will take you through the questions. So Grace, since I know that there are a lot of questions, maybe you can couple 2 or 3 and then Ranjan can answer that briefly. Right?
Thank you, Professor Malhotra. Thank you, Professor Ranjan Ghosh, for this thought-provoking talk. And if you now allow, I would like to pose questions that we have received from our audience. So the first question is from the Charan Pahadi. He wants to ask, if there is any link between Bakhtin's concept of heteroglossia and polymeric texts.
Okay, should I answer this first?
Yeah, well, the second question is about AI. So maybe you can combine both.
Well, these are different. Let me talk about Bakhtin. Bakhtin, yes, heteroglossia, yes. The hetero is very much a part of the understanding of linguistic differences, obviously. And heteroglossia, yes, it can obviously lead to a different set of interpretation in terms of how language or how discourses can unground you and can produce a sort of debordement. That is there, but Bakhtin's understanding, which is primarily dialogic, something that has a sort of a post-Hegelian dialectic to that, I wouldn't probably say that the kind of plastic theory I have would really be of Bakhtinian heteroglossic. I would rather say that this entire understanding of literature and arts, as you can see in my book, if you go to another chapter in the book, which is called Plastic Touch, that talks entirely about art. That is how the plastic artists have produced different varieties of art. And when they're producing art, they are using the material to turn into the aesthetic. So, it is the material's ability to transform itself, the material's ability to heterogenize itself, the material's ability to create a kind of a separate discourse in its own way. So the aesthetic of creating a poem or aesthetic of creating a piece of art or any other understanding, this is inherently there in the material. So I know that's a very easy temptation, of course, to see heteroglossia being connected with plastic, but probably something I'm telling something way beyond that. So plastic theory is probably a little different than that, yes.
Yeah, so the next question is from Suchito Nath, and he sort of links AI, and he says that can identify plastic nature of poetry help us add molecules of poetry to pre-existing structures, possibly giving rise to new poetic chemicals?
Sorry, I didn't get this question. What
Can
is that?
I can identifying the plastic nature of poetry help us add molecules of poetry to pre-existing
No,
structures?
no, no. There is a problem with this. Plastic nature of poetry is not what I'm talking about. Because when
Okay.
you say plastic nature of poetry, you are talking about plasticity of poetry. And there has been work done on that. As I said, as many examples that I can give you here, with people like Evelyn Reilly being the poet who has written a collection of poems called Styrofoam. Now, when you're talking about this collection of poems by Evelyn Reilly, then Styrofoam is a collection that talks about plastic as it is expressed in different forms, say different poetic forms, different poetic structures, in different poetic methodologies, but it is on plastic. They are talking about plastic. I'm not talking about that. I am actually talking about uh, the plasticity of plastic and how plastic starts to influence the way we start to think about literature and the arts. So, the material is helping me to understand the aesthetic. So Westland has its own plastic nature. Westland definitely has its own plastic nature. And I remember having read a nice piece, which says that Tiresias in Westland is a very important plastic figure. So that is about plasticity, where I think Malabou's plastic reading can be extremely helpful, a way of looking at it. But that is not what I'm talking about here. So plastic nature is not the point here. The thing is that it's the material that starts to, in a way, influence and help us to think the aesthetic. That is the point here.
Thank you. The next question is from Arka Chattopadhyay from IIT Gandhinagar. She says she's still reading your book, and but however, she has some questions to clarify. So the first question she asked is that, is there a particular reason as to why you use a plastic as a metonym for material? Can this be generalized outside the plastic in other materials? And why aren't you using polymer, for example? Because not all polymers are plastic, though, but all plastics are polymers.
Okay, first of all, Orko is a he, because I can see Orko there. So Orko, I think, thanks for joining. And yes, I will say, yes, Orko is right. I mean, all plastics are polymers, but the thing is that since I have termed it as plastic term, I did not say that it is a polymeric term. So the point is that the focus starts to come back on plastic. So it is just exactly when one reads the polymer sciences, I'm not saying plastic sciences, I'm saying polymer sciences. So when one reads polymer sciences, there are other areas as well that come into it, but the focus was on plastic for me. So even though if you talk about the behavior of the polymers, say the plastomers for that matter, they behave a little differently than plastic. There are many different varieties and forms of plastics that come up. But when you are talking about high intensity plastic, low intensity plastic, and the different kinds of plastic that produces extremely non-biodegradable plastic, biodegradable plastics, are different kinds of plastic. I mean, so the behavior changes, but the point about my argument was that I had to come down to a point where I could select certain levels of plastic behavior that are more or less uniform. Because if I start to talk about, say, polyester or polyethylene, then I have to focus on polyethylene only, because polyethylene has an entire subject to deal with, or polyester has an entire subject to deal with, or polystyrene for that matter. So I really had to see a connection between the different versions and the different manifestations of plastic, so that once I find a sort of a common trait, that would be very helpful for me for understanding, or else it'll be very confusing. people would say whether Westland is polystyrene or whether it's polyester, then it really gets very difficult. Then already people are well confounded by what I said, and they would just not even listen to me. I mean, there will not be 2 people on the portal after this.
Yeah. So Arco's third question, I'll combine it with another question. So Arco is asking, how is plastic intertextuality of the material poem different from Malibu's plastic ontology of forms, except that she doesn't extend this argument onto the aesthetic in any necessary sense? So we have another person, Nabonita. She has something similar. She says existence of plastic as material aesthetic. I mean, she wants to know if the existence of the plastic as material aesthetic concept is dependent on human structuration as or through our scientific or humanities discourses, or does it already have a built-in model, a metaphysical thing that structures our thought? So.
Yeah, I mean, what Orko is saying about Malibu is that Malibu is also talking about when she talks about plastic reading. I was very influenced by her ideas of the structured plasticity. I also see that when Malibu talks about Hegel, and he is talking about the 3 different things that plastic can do, like the whole ability of plastic to annihilate, to transform itself. But at the same time, plastic also had the ability to self-annihilate. So plastic can explode. So, you know, the French derivation that Malibu shows us is that plastic can be translated as a bomb. So when it becomes a bomb, it explodes. So we usually say the plastic explosives. So when you say plastic explosives, it does not really mean that you're producing a form. You are actually breaking a form down. But this annihilation of the form is almost like I'm producing a form. At the same time, I am destroying myself of all forms. So, you know, this dialectic seems to work wonderfully in that sort of a concept where I am the form giver as well as I am the form destroyer. So there is a way of looking at this destructive plasticity in Malibu. I wouldn't say that I wasn't influenced, but again, my interest again goes back to the material, because Malibu is exhausting. Malibu is overwhelming, I tell you. Even Catherine is on the portal. I will tell Catherine, you are overwhelming. When I read your work, I just told myself, what else can I write on plastic? Because you are so exhaustive, you are so brilliant that you almost covered almost all areas in the way I can talk about plastic. So when I read through Hegel and Heidegger, and when I was looking at Malibu's interpretation of Nietzsche, then, you know, there was nothing much that I could have added to that. So when I wanted to add something to this plastic humanities or plastic studies or discourse, then the only thing that I did not find was that this real anchorage in the material. Once you get into that material, you start to see the structure. It is just not the human structuration. It is just not the agency of the human who is structuring it. For me, it is the material that already has a structure to which you can connect. So if you say polyvinyl chloride, and the way the equations that I've put there, when you look at it, you see there is already a structure inherent in that. And then, of course, the agency of the human, the aesthetic will come in, because aesthetic is all about how you schematize, because the word aesthetic actually means how you are systematizing a part. So when you're systematizing a part, you already have a system before you to which you can correspond. So, you know, this is how the whole idea of, for me, my second book is basically on plastic is this, where I'm talking about the figural plasticity, where plastic is talking about certain figures and how those figures in my next book, well, this book I did not talk about it, but in the next book, these figures, they are explaining our secularity, our history, our religion, our understanding of nature. So all these things are coming into this. Is not there in this book because it doesn't talk about figurality at all. It just talks about the material aesthetic here.
Yeah, we have a few more questions lined up for you. So the next question is from Gitanjali Roy. She asks, what about digital poems that doesn't have any material existence, but again, based on the understanding of lubricity model and crystalline amorphous textuality, the science created in the virtual space helps develop the digital text. How would then polymerization happen aesthetically in digital poems?
Well, this is something for you to discover, because I just proposed sort of this material aesthetic model. But if you think that, well, I'm so excited. If you think that this lubricity model or the gel theory model, that really works in your understanding of the digital poetry, that's wonderful, because um, uh, the whole point, the whole argument about this book is that you are turning to plastic, but when you turn into plastic, your turning is a very different one. Your turning is not about this conventional anchorages that you look into, like climate, Anthropocene, pollution, waste studies, discard studies. This is not what it is about. You're turning to plastic to actually get yourself a different resultic or structural model that you can find out of the plastic itself. But if you think that this lubricity and the gel theory that I've just proposed in understanding the Westland also works in your digital poetry methodology or digital poetry frameworks, that is fantastic. You can just go ahead and write a wonderful paper of that.
Yeah. So our next question is from Rupam Roy. So he asked, is there any possibility to make a symmetry between your impeccable plastic theory with Tennessee Williams' plastic theater?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. But again, I would say that even if you're looking at plastic theater or Williams, um, again, you have to see few things. I think Tennessee Williams' plastic theater has more to do with plasticity and less to do with the plastic as the material. But if you think so, that you can use this theorization and concepts of plastic material aesthetic in the understanding of Tennessee Williams, you are just free to do that. But I'm absolutely sure all the writings that I have seen on Williams's plastic theater, they are mostly about the plasticity. They are assuming, I mean, it is a kind of a prior predisposed assumption that there is a plasticity involved. But my argument is that if you can read through this material aesthetic of this book, spend your time on these pages of this book, because I've put in 5 years into it, so you can at least put in 5 hours. So if you can just focus and anchor on this book, you would see that I think this material aesthetic would also be very helpful in understanding plastic theater. I'm pretty sure about that. Because I will tell you, I'll just butt in to say something. In the 1930s, there was also the development of something called plastic semiotics. So I'm going to talk about these things later in my book or in my projects. But plastic semiotics also talks about this semiotical structure of plasticity, because in 1920s and 1930s, plasticity started to become a philosophical phenomenon. Say Pierre Mondrian talks about plasticity there. And plasticism was very much a modernist phenomenon. So my book, in the initial big part of it, talks about it, that how the material aesthetic starts to explain modernity. But again, plasticity is not the charge here. It is the plastic, the material. That is our hero.
We have 2 more questions, and I'll just combine it. Maybe you can take them together, because I think it'll be a great explanation if you can sort of answer it together. So Arnab Chakrabarti is really moved by your explanation of this free volume created in Wasteland through the introduction of polar and non-polar apolar plasticizer. So he wants to know, how does one think about the historicity of the plasticizers that generate a montage of worlds within this cosmopolitan character of the end product of the Wasteland slash PVC? And how does one think about the hermeneutical situation of plasticizers in the end product? Similarly, Asima Sarkar wants to know about the material aesthetics as proposed through plastic transforms our reading of literature, and also based on the equation of x, y, and x hyphen y that you have put forward in the initial part of your lecture. Is there can we develop an aesthetics or literature that transform our reading or thinking of plastic?
Well, it's expansive questions, but I would just keep it short, and I would say that yes, plastic turn. When one talks about this plastic turn, then as I said, that plastic turn is trying to build a different kind of a poesis. And plastic turn, when you say that when I'm turning to the material, I'm actually making a sort of a movement. Because if you go to the etymology of the word turn, and then you would see that turn is also about a twist. Turn is about also an abrupt walking towards something. Turn is also taking a bend. So when you take a turn, then you know that the poesis of understanding changes. My argument all through has been to change the poesis of understanding. We have focused on the text. We have, say, if you go back to the theoretical structure of the 20th century, there are many things that happen there in terms of the avant-garde movements. In terms of the avant-garde movements, or in terms of the different experimentations that people have done over the years. I mean, in the entire 20th century, philosophically or aesthetically, or in the field of literature and arts, people have done that. But the thing is that whenever we have done something, our premises have remained within literature. Our premises have remained within humanities. But this, the Clifford Geertz calling it this blur zones, this fuzzy, blurry zones of sciences and arts. And this is something that I wanted to explore through the plastic term. Because when you use the word plastic, remember, the first thought that comes to your mind that it is from the sciences. It's a material. It is not something that comes from the arts. If you say plasticity, then that's different. But again, plasticity follows from plastic. But the first thought that came to me was that there was no plastic before 1910 and 20. So there was no plastic whatsoever. We only had plasticity. I mean, whether it's look at William James, or whether we look at Nietzsche or Heidegger or Hegel, or you're going back to the Renaissance period, Potts and others, they have all spoken about plasticity. So there are two kinds of plasticity here. One is that the plasticity before plastic, that's one. And the second one is the plasticity after plastic. Now, if these are the two arrangements that you make, or rather you can put it as a kind of chronological breakup, if you can call it. If you can, that's the kind of a thing you do. Then you see the important thing that I'm talking about here is only plastic. Plasticity before plastic, again plastic. Plasticity after plastic, again the plastic. So I'm not talking about plasticity. My whole interest and focus and premium is on the material plastic and nothing else. So how is it that this particular thing, plastic, the material, it changes the way in how we create this poesis of interpretation? You're reading, look, which is why I read a few lines from the book to tell you that when I was writing it, then the entire vocabulary, when you read the book, is so different. I mean, you will all the time feel that there are certain new words that you're very annoyed by. When I say the Westland as a supramolecular structure. Now, when you say supramolecular structure, you're a little annoyed by this because you are more interested in a postmodern structure. You're interested in intertextual structure. Or maybe you're interested in a palimpsestic structure. When these words were used, you were not annoyed. When the palimpsest was used, you said, oh my, it's a great word. I'm going to use it in every lecture that I give or a book I write. But when I am using a supramolecular structure, then you're very annoyed because you don't want to invest into understanding what that particular concept means. I am forcing you to read this book to see whether you invest in these concepts and see how they help you to think and devise and strategize and systematize or structure literature and literary thinking differently. That was the intention.
Thank you, Professor Ghosh, for your patience and for this thought-provoking lecture. And I must tell you that we received an overwhelming response of questions and comments in the chat box. Some of the audience are reading your book, and they would surely get back to you in the future. And I'm sure we all have greatly benefited from this Q&A session. Thank you once again. I now pass this virtual mic to my colleague Aparna. Over to you, Aparna.
Good evening, everyone. It has been an intellectual treat to listen to Professor Ranjan Ghosh speak. And on behalf of the Department of English and the organizing team, I would like to thank everyone who made today's event successful. First and foremost, a huge thank you to our speaker, Professor Ghosh, who has given us so much to reflect on. His talk was truly enriching, and as a think piece will be discussed beyond this evening and will certainly help us all think through these issues. Thank you, Professor Ghosh, for lending us so much of your time and for sharing your insights with us. We are indeed grateful to you.
Thank you.
As always, I would also like to thank our HOD, Professor Simi Malhotra. Thank you to Suman, Grace, Zara, and everyone on the organizing team who are responsible for running our event so smoothly. And thank you to our audience, everyone who tuned in today from all sorts of time zones and places. Thank you so much, friends, and we hope to see you again all very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ranjan. So grateful to you. Thanks so much for doing this. And I'm sure all of us are going to go and get your book and start reading it. What a fascinating work, and really looking forward to the other two too. So I'm sure, I mean, after the material and the aesthetic, the figural will be another leap altogether. Thanks so much, Ranjan.
Thank you, Simi. I overstepped the temporal restraints, but I'm sorry.
No, not at all. I mean, you've seen. I mean, the audience hasn't flagged. I mean, they're raring to go and have so many questions. We couldn't ask all the questions, but you know, that's always the case with all the talks. But yeah, thanks so much for your patience. You gave us so much time. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Simi.
So much
Thanks
to
a
think
lot.
about.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.